Good afternoon, Professor Tariq Modood. Thank you very much for having this conversation with me. We are all very fortunate today to have with us Professor Modood, who is a professor at Bristol University in UK. He's also the director for the Center for Ethnicity and Citizenship. He's one of the most prominent voices, both in academia and in the public sphere, on the subjects of secularism, multiculturalism, national identity, racial equality, and social justice. I have been a big fan of his work, and I consider him one of the most prominent scholars who are exploring the challenges that Western Europe in particular and democratic societies are facing as a result of the explosion of diversity, ethnic, cultural, religious, and racial diversity, or at least recognition of the fact that there are far more diverse societies in the world today, and how to cope with them in a manner in which everybody's rights are protected and everybody is treated equally. I also think that Professor Tariq Modood is one of the most prominent Muslim intellectuals in the world, period, undoubtedly. And so thank you very much for having a conversation with me, Professor. So without beating around the bush, I want to jump.
So no pressure then.
No pressure at all. So without beating around the bush, let me right away ask you the question that you don't like answering. Does Brexit and the rise of white nationalism and the election of people like Donald Trump and Boris Johnson suggest that while multiculturalism may not be dead, it is dying?
Yeah, well, multiculturalism has been struggling for a long time. And presumably you mean, is it dead or dying in Britain when you say Brexit and so on, though you mentioned Trump as well. So I think the situation is different in different countries. I suppose one's got to say that Brexit wasn't good for multiculturalism, not because the European Union is good for multiculturalism. In fact, we are the most multiculturalist state within the Union. So when we leave it, the European Union will be less multiculturalist. But nevertheless, the way that the Brexit debate was conducted, the amount of focus, negative stereotyping of migrants, and the focus on foreigners, people who didn't belong here, people who were a problem. I think clearly those are very negative vibes for multiculturalism. The main target, in terms of any group of people, the main target, of course, were East European citizens in Britain under the freedom of movement of the European Union. But nevertheless, they weren't the only target. And also when one particular group's being targeted, there's often a kind of an overspill. And so certainly other groups, including settled British minorities, also got some of the flack. Though at the same time, it has to be said that no one knows precisely, but some surveys suggest that perhaps something like 30% of British ethnic minorities voted for leave. And some of the reasons that they gave for voting for leave were actually not very dissimilar to that given by the white British population, though 30% is obviously a smaller proportion than the white support for leave. So whether this will be an encouragement and a growth of white nationalism, as you asked, well, I don't know. I mean, it certainly could be. I mean, that's of course a real fear, but I don't think it has to be. And of course, something has happened very dramatic in the last couple of months, and that is the COVID-19 virus, which has completely changed the nature of the debate here. People have forgotten entirely about Brexit. And we were, as a result of the referendum and the debate both leading into it and after it, we were a very divided society, as indeed the United States is. But actually, under the national emergency of the virus, we have come together. And not only are we not talking about the divisions of Brexit, but we're not really talking about any divisions. We're all talking about pulling together as a country and supporting the NHS that has suddenly become from a Cinderella to a hero, war hero fighting for Britain and for the lives of British people. And people recognize that, of course, ethnic minorities have always been overrepresented in the National Health Service, as have migrants in general. And I think this is changing the character of the debate at the moment. But of course, it may be very different again in a few months' time and after the virus is under control, which perhaps won't be a few months, perhaps it'll be a lot longer than that, till we have a vaccine. So I think there is a real problem, a real worry about the rise of populist nationalism. And I think there are multiculturalist responses to the rise of that nationalism. Whether they will be successful or not, I don't know. I think the first thing is, can multiculturalism rally together all the people who are opposed to an exclusivist mono-nationalism? Because I think it'd be fair to say that what you might call the pro-diversity half of the electorate, of the public, are divided. We don't have a single idea of what is the good society or what is the appropriate response to right-wing nationalism. Some people worry about nationalism in all its forms, and other people, like myself, have always thought of multiculturalism as something that is framed within national citizenship and actually requires remaking British national identity. So you can't be against British national identity because then there's nothing to remake. We just will be fragmented. So I think that we shouldn't give up the long-term project of multiculturalizing British citizenship and Britain as a country that we belong to and want to belong to, and that we demand acceptance where we are excluded. We demand acceptance and equality as full British citizens. I think that is still the same project. And I don't know, I'd like to be optimistic that the project is not dead. I mean, one of the indications for saying it's not dead is that there is quite a lot of support for diversity in the country. I mean, even with the Leave vote and the Remain vote and so on, as you know, the margin was very small. And so even if we were to say, the Leave vote is anti-diversity and the Remain vote is pro-diversity, which is, a bit oversimplistic, we're not talking about a very big difference. And we've seen in elections that there are parts of the country, mainly in the larger cities, but including my own city of Bristol, which is a medium-sized city, real pro-diversity electorates, pro-diversity constituencies. And so I think that we actually haven't got a narrative that unites the pro-diversity half of the country. And if we can have a vision that unites us, we could then offer that to some of the, as it were, the other side, the people who have a sense of national identity and see multiculturalism and immigration as a threat to national identity. So I think multiculturalism actually could play a unifying role with the diversity half of the electorate and a bridging role with the other half.
You know, there are many complexities with this approach. For example, in the United States, I think that COVID-19 is actually exacerbating divisions rather than bringing people together. And I think that the economic fallout of this, and when people start suffering financially for an extended period, if we have a recession, if we have unemployment, then I think we are going to also experience a serious resentment among society, and so often minorities, weak minorities, are scapegoated, and you can see this, for example, in India, as how Muslims are being scapegoated as spreaders of they did make a mistake, one institution. However, I fear that is going to happen. But my question to you about multiculturalism is multiculturalism an aspirational public philosophy, or is it a social condition? If it is a social reality, no matter how much you deny the normative aspects of it, the empirical aspects will just smack you in your face. It will keep jumping that the society looks multicultural. There are diversity, there are minorities, and either the state pretends not to see the minorities and then governs as if it is a monocultural or monoracial society, or in order to advance good governance, it begins to recognize diversity. However, a lot of these discussions that I notice tend to put additional burden on the state, its institutions, and the majority community to compromise on these cultural differences, while making concessions such as allowing dual citizenship, dual loyalties, multiple loyalties to minorities, which in terms of national security issues can be hugely problematic. So sometimes when I sit in national security conversations with people with dual citizenships, it's problematic because I'm tempted to ask them, which country are you representing? So this is a serious issue, at least maybe in the national security arena. But as things become more threatening to the state, the environment has become a national security issue. We have securitized migration, we have securitized religious differences. Then multiculturalism begins to become a philosophy which is a threat to the idea of a nation state. And maybe the backlash against multiculturalism may have contributed to the rise of ethno-nationalism.
Yeah, I agree that there's a backlash effect. But you started off by saying, by multiculturalism, do we mean a certain social condition, or do we mean, as it were, a political project? Well, we can't have multiculturalism without certain social conditions, without a certain kind of plurality. But social plurality isn't an ism. So multiculturalism has to be a political project. That's certainly how I understand it. Otherwise, we don't need the ism. So what is the political project? The political project is to take what we might call liberal citizenship, or a citizenship that doesn't engage with cultural identities, because it takes the existing cultural hegemonies, the dominant culture and so on, as natural, as the backdrop in which citizenship should be exercised. It takes that and says, that's not full equal citizenship. Yes, we need sameness of treatment, same rights, non-discrimination, and that's what's going to be what will count as equality in most cases. But there are some cases where cultural difference, where minority identities have to be recognized as having a distinctive character with their own cultural needs. And that requires some degree of differential attention, of, for instance, allowing a policeman to wear a turban, which, for many countries was not part of a police uniform. It is in the UK now. It is in the Mounties in Canada, and it may be in the United States. I don't think it is. Perhaps it is in some states. I don't know. But instead, so here you have a case where equality of opportunity, equality to employment, equality to being a police officer and respected as a police officer does not require uniformity of dress, but requires an adaptation to allow the Sikh to be a Sikh and a British police officer, or whatever the case may be. So I think the multicultural project is to recognize, whether it is in issues to do with employment, or the educational curriculum, or broadcasting, the public media, and especially our politics, our public space. By politics, I don't just mean political parties and so on. I mean a public sphere in the broadest sense. Recognizing that this is a ethno-culturally and ethno-religiously complex shared space, and we should adapt our sense of national citizenship and our sense of what our country is, what it is to be a member of this country, to be British or to be American, adapt that in the light of these circumstances so that all can have a sense of belonging. So we don't have first class and second class citizenship just because of issues around cultural identities. So it's showing how it is possible to be British and Muslim, possible to be Black British, to be a Hindu and English, and so on. So that, I think, is the political project, and of course it presupposes certain social conditions, and it also presupposes that economic inequalities are not severe, certainly less than what we have at the moment in our two countries, and it definitely has to be where economic inequalities are not stratified across, ethnicity and race, that they don't match divisions of ethnicity and race. So it's a broader concept than just to do with the inclusion of identities, but I think the core of multiculturalism is about remaking identities in the context of equal citizenship.
Well, I heard your conversation, your talk. It was quite a brilliant one you gave on the birthday of Charles Taylor in Canada, in which you start by defining secularism as an institutional arrangement in which the institutions of the state and institutions of religion are separate, and you obviously do not see, you define it by saying that as long as the religious institutions do not draw their authority from religious sources. That was an important point that you made. However, you also talk about moderate secularism at some point. And when I was reading that in conjunction with some of the other theorists who are talking about multiculturalism, I find that even though it feels as if we want secularism in order to prevent the minorities from being overwhelmed by the religious values of the majority. However, we want that secularism to be moderate enough to allow the minorities to enjoy certain special circumstances based on their religious identity. For example, if we say that we want to foster multiculturalism as against melting pot, so we have a bunch of immigrants. Let's say we get 2 million migrants suddenly coming to Britain from Saudi Arabia. And so should Britain compromise some of its democratic human rights issues to accept gender discrimination, which is common in Saudi society, and say, oh, this is Saudi culture. This is Saudi religious understanding that women are subordinate to men. And therefore, while we talk about equal rights, etc., we should also allow this particular segment of the Muslim community. Equality is to treat them as equals to the majority community. However, we also let them practice discrimination in their mosques, in their religious institutions. They force their women to cover, etc. So how do we reconcile these two competing goals of equality and also accommodation of cultural and religious particularities of new minorities?
Yeah, so a lot of people sometimes say, well, multiculturalism is all about group rights, and there is a sense in which it is, and therefore it somehow compromises individual rights. But actually, no multiculturalist theorist that I know of argues like that. Most assume a robust backdrop of individual rights. So issues around group identities and group accommodation are in addition to individual rights. They're not a matter of eroding or taking away individual rights. So individual rights in relation to men and women, individual rights in relation to people of different sexualities, individual rights insofar as children have legal rights in our countries and so on. So I see all those as just, in place and enforced where necessary. But I can certainly see that there are cultures that might have different gender relations within the community you used, within the mosque and so on. And the question then would be, is this permissible or not? And I think we have to say that, of course, this is, if you like, part of individual freedom, that people can have those relations as long as it is within the framework of the law of equality. So obviously not discrimination. So you said, can they discriminate in the mosque and so on? Well, only in the way that Catholics discriminate in church. You can't be a woman priest in the Catholic Church. So that it may well be the case that in your example, the Saudi Arabian migrants who become British citizens have a practice where they too say, no, a woman can't lead prayer. Well, it's not for the British state to say who should and shouldn't lead prayer, but there will be, of course, debates and arguments and influences and so on. And if we actually look at British Muslim attitudes, they have changed quite considerably. If you track them, from say the 1990s to now, so, looking at 20 to 30 years, on issues around should married women with small children go out to work, on questions about should homosexuality be criminalized and so on. You see a genuine shift of opinion at the very same time, in the very same period, that on the whole, British Muslims have become, as it were, more religious, more practicing, and more, as it were, having a higher level of Muslim consciousness. They've actually shifted in a more liberal direction. And if you then do an age analysis of those surveys and so on, you see, of course, that it's younger people that are driving the change. So, of course, that will happen, and that should happen freely, not through threats and pressures about assimilation or government interference, or the government will fund certain bodies and not fund other civil society bodies and so on. Not like that, but through allowing different influences in a more kind of what you might call a dialogical way. So people should certainly be able to criticize Muslim views about gender if they want to. Question them, criticize them, say they're not good enough, say they should change or change fast or whatever. And Muslims should be able to have their own responses, you know, in a dialogical way and say, no, this is what we think and so on. But they should also, and this will happen naturally, conversations amongst Muslims themselves, change and adapt in ways that they think suitable, that they think best. So I see change in a multicultural society not as an erosion of individual rights, but nor through either social or state pressure to change and assimilate at a pace that the minority doesn't want to move at.
Well, I mean, while I do follow British intellectual provocations from Muslims, I am not that familiar with empirical realities on the ground. However, I do follow the American Muslim condition very closely, and I find that 15 years seems to be some kind of a magical figure for anybody who's lived in the US as a Muslim for 15 years. They have a markedly more liberal, more tolerant, more pluralistic, more accommodationist values than people who are fresh off the boat because they're bringing cultures. Unfortunately, sometimes people who come to the countries, new immigrants tend to flock a lot to the mosque, so the mosques tend to be more conservative than, and in the last 4 or 5 years, I've seen the statistics on acceptance of gay marriage. For example, Muslims have moved from 27% to a significant majority have now accepted it. But one of the challenges that I realize is that there seems to be a kind of global Islamophobia at this moment. Which is very frightening, whether it is Muslims in Britain or UK, Muslims in India or anywhere. There seems to be the problem with citizenship, with accommodation, religious accommodation. But in the last 4 or 5 years, I sometimes talk on security issues, and I try to make this point that I see two imaginary highways. One highway where people are migrating in large numbers from the Middle East to Europe, running to save their lives, so to speak, from Syria and Iraq and others. And then on the other side is the next generation of Muslims who are then traveling back to simply go and die in Iraq and join terrorist organizations like ISIS. I mean, the recruitment of European Muslims is stunning from European countries. A continent where multiculturalism became a state project, and governments have invested far more in trying to accommodate Muslims in order to co-opt them and so on and so forth. So what is the connection between, is it the success of multiculturalism in Europe that made the new generation of Muslims, including women, wanting to join ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, or was it failure of multiculturalism? Like what is the connection? Why do they feel more, especially those who are born in Britain and growing up and have lived never anywhere else, why do they feel more loyal to Iraq and that to a terrorist organization like ISIS than the UK? Yes, they are a tiny minority, but significant enough to be troublesome, isn't it?
Yeah. So the numbers are small, even though what people choose to do by going and joining ISIS or giving their lives to ISIS and so on is certainly shocking. So how is that, if at all, connected to multiculturalism? Well, I suppose the connection could be like this. So as a political idea, multiculturalism says to minorities, you know, you don't have to assimilate. You have various rights and opportunities and can demand rights to participate in the public political life of the country as an equal citizen and so on, without having to be ashamed of your background, efface your identity, hide your religion, and so on. So yes, so in that sense, you could say that multiculturalism gives minorities a certain kind of self-confidence and assertiveness and opportunities and legitimacy to mobilize, to make claims upon the state, to make claims upon fellow citizens. But to say that, to take a leap from that, to say, therefore, people will then be attracted to violent ideologies and go to places like ISIS and so on, I just can't see the connection. There's nothing in multiculturalism that would lead to that conclusion. Just the opposite, because multiculturalism is about interacting with other groups in your society and wanting to make a claim upon the country in which you are a citizen. Though I take your point that, you know, a multicultural society accepts dual or multiple citizenship. But it's about remaking the country so that you are fully accepted as an equal in that country. And that does involve some political conflict and mobilization and, if you like, some social and political pain. I can't deny that. We see that. But it is not a legitimation of violence, either domestic violence or, as it were, international terrorist networks violence. So I don't see it connects with multiculturalism at all. In many ways, it is an espousal, an absolutist single identity which runs quite counter to all the sensibility of multiculturalism, which is about respect for other people's identities, as well as wanting your own identity to be recognized and respected where it is not. So asserting equality for yourself, both in symbolic and institutional and civic ways, but also wanting to be a part of a citizenship with other people. So the citizenship runs, as it were, horizontally, that is to say, with other fellow citizens, as well as vertically in the relationship between yourselves as a group or as individuals and the state. So there's obviously that vertical relationship, which is largely recognized in liberal theory. But multiculturalism, like other forms of communitarianism, also recognizes the importance of the horizontal relationships between citizens and of developing and fostering those. So I think anything remotely like an espousal of a absolutist ideology and the violence that we're talking about, I just can't see any connection with multiculturalism. And of course, it has weakened multiculturalism because it has created the backlash that you refer to. But obviously, Muslims in this country and in the United States and in so many other countries have suffered a very big reputational damage that they have not been equipped, able to make good. I mean, they haven't had the power, the tsunami of suspicion and distrust and Islamophobia against them has been such that it's very difficult to say, well, look, we're only talking about, 5,000 or 10,000, a minority 5,000, 10,000. This collective blame about all Muslims and everything Islamic is totally undeserved and unwarranted. It's very difficult to argue like that when people are so shocked and frightened by what they see as the behavior of some Muslims. And perhaps you could say that Muslims in Europe and North America perhaps need to think about more sophisticated strategies of political self-presentation. I mean, I think we have been improving all the time.
Yeah.
And of course, it's such a loaded dice to argue against tabloid stereotyping day after day after day. But nevertheless, I think if you take your citizenship in Britain or America seriously, in a way, that's what you're committed to doing, not to saying, oh, I'll go and bomb up a allied target in Iraq.
Well, for someone who is a bit more involved in these issues, I have developed, I'm very sensitive to how the media oversensitizes this, makes it more sensational. For example, every time I hear a phrase saying that it seems like an act of terrorism, but it appears that the terrorist acted alone, and there are some mental health issues about, then it's a white Christian guy, right away. The code word, he has mental health issues, or he acted alone. There has been no investigation, we have no proof, but we're going to assume he acted alone, so that his group, his religion, his community, even his terrorist organization is not implicated. So even the whole KKK is not implicated in acts of individual KKK members. And then, of course, the way, if it's a Muslim perpetrator, then there appears to be an international connection and so on. The media tends to do that, and as a very tiny minority, Muslims in America are less than 1%. We struggle against this. However, I also feel that are the minorities themselves accepting the philosophical normative premises of the multicultural project? So, for example, I was invited to participate in a project on religious pluralism, and I participated in the conference. I even wrote my paper and then withdrew at the last minute because I sensed a particular problem where Muslims, I think, want to have political equality without extending moral equality to the others. So Saddam Hussein is such a horrible man, but one day he will eventually go to heaven because he is a Muslim, whereas Mother Teresa, no matter how much service she provided, she's going to hell because she is a mushrik. So this moral inequality of the other, and sometimes irrevocable, something that can never be salvaged, is excluded from salvation. This is things that we teach to our children in our religious sermons, this moral inequality. And I find it very difficult as to how then can we demand and advocate multiculturalism, political equality, cultural equality, racial equality, when we do not want to teach that within the community itself and with others. And that is a fundamental challenge. I've been talking about this for 20 years in the US. Now, increasingly more and more younger people are beginning to understand that, but they are also getting estranged from the community. So the community has become amorphous, and so it doesn't respond like a coherent institution. And I wonder if the project of nation states, in theory, will collapse under a multicultural agenda. So there should be no difference between France, Saudi Arabia, or Nepal, because everybody are the same and there are no differences. However, that is not a historical or empirical reality. There are wealth inequalities, power inequalities, and so constantly demanding, I mean, how long can we rely on the majority's goodwill for projects such as multiculturalism, liberal citizenship, equality, to win the day when minorities themselves are not fully committed to those same very principles of normative equality, fundamental equality of all people?
Well, of course, the most important equality that we're really concerned with in this conversation, in our work, and my work anyway, is civic equality or political equality. But what you say about Muslims, I mean, this could be said about lots of Christians.
Yes, evangelical
today,
Christians, for
and certainly in
example.
the very recent past.
Yes.
Sorry?
Evangelical.
Yeah, and especially I would suspect in the United States.
Yeah.
In Britain, I think Christians don't draw such sharp lines about who's going to be saved and who is not. They certainly used to. And in Europe, still many do. But I think in the United States, you have certain evangelical traditions which says, you know, the belief that, you know, Jesus came down to the cross and died for you and so on is absolutely central to your salvation. Otherwise, you can be as nice a person as, you know, anybody, but it's not good enough to save you. So I do think that religious people can have that view, and sometimes it's much more what I might call theologically driven than driven by what they really believe in their heart or what is manifested in their actions. And when you call that a lack of moral respect or moral equality, I wouldn't call it that. I think it's more to do with something theological or spiritual. So yes, Muslims like Christians think that the true believer is in some sense at a higher level than the person of another religion or of no religion. Yes, that's certainly true for a lot of Muslims, but that's not translated into lack of moral respect or into political inequality. So I mean, it's not a good attitude, but it's not always one that people act on. I think sometimes people have certain theological doctrines that they then interpret differently in terms of their actions. These actions could be about their relations with their neighbors, how they get on with their neighbors who may be, let's say, especially now in the days of COVID-19, that might be severely ill and close to death and so on. They will act with compassion at human suffering, not just in, oh, so you're getting ready to go to hell if you are a Muslim, or if you could quickly become a Muslim in the next day or two, maybe a better fate lies for you and so on. I think there are very few people who think like that. So I'm not a theologian. I wouldn't really deign to say how to interpret some of these things. But what I would say is that most people's lives and social relations and their understanding of political projects are multi-layered and quite nuanced, and they're not governed by what we might call literalist theology. For the most part, are not governed by that.
I mean, that is rather reassuring. I wanted to talk about two trends that we are witnessing globally. Since 2006, there has been a retreat of democracy. And if you are familiar with the work that Larry Diamond and others are doing at the Institute for the Journal of Democracy, and they have been recording as to how two things have happened. There are fewer democracies in the world today than there were in 2016. And even those which are qualified or meet the benchmark of being labeled as democratic societies, even the quality of democracy in those countries has reduced. So for example, the United States now is a struggling democracy. It is not a full democracy. I was looking, we are below South Korea now when it comes to the quality of democracy, according to the measures by groups which are very sympathetic to the US. These are US institutions who think that the US is not in the top 25 democracies in the world. So we are seeing a democratic retreat, which means if countries become less democratic, obviously that means human rights, civil rights, and all these issues of racial equality, affirmative action, all of these things will suffer because societies are less democratic. And the second trend that we are witnessing and might witness is the rise of authoritarianism I mean, the world's biggest and the world's oldest democracies are now governed by populist authoritarian leaders who seem to have absolutely no respect for the constitution of their country or the democratic traditions of their society. Uh, and and some of the most iconic countries on whom we rely on in various regions for being democratic are also witnessing this rise of populism. So with the decline, I mean, the two are obviously connected. And then add to that these pandemics, which are going to make people more afraid of others, less willing to travel, and a kind of retreat of globalization. These liberal projects of not only bringing racial equality, but also gender equality, equality between people of different faiths, different national origins, I fear that they are all these good citizen, let's promote an egalitarian society. These projects are going to suffer significantly from these trends. Do you also agree, or you are more optimistic than I am?
It is a big trend. I certainly agree with you. These kind of authoritarian leaders that are imposing and imposing a kind of majoritarian populace, you know, whether it's Putin, Erdogan, Modi now, and so on. Yeah, Trump, and in a way, some of that flavor was present in Brexit. So yeah, of course I worry about it, in a way, getting back to where we started. I suppose the two things I would say is, firstly, I've emphasized a couple of times in this conversation that my understanding of multiculturalism, which isn't just unique to me, I think this is true about the political theorists of multiculturalism in general, have seen multiculturalism as a development out of the idea of national citizenship. But at the same time, there has been an allied trend in liberal democracies and beyond, which have emphasized human rights individualism, which, if you take to its logical conclusion, is that citizenship doesn't matter because we're all human beings. So actually the only way that we should distribute rights is to distribute them to all people, not just worry about your citizens and the institutions that enforce equality and respect your rights and so on within your own country. I regret that that's been the case, but it is certainly true. There has been a large development of liberalism, of kind of a left-wing liberalism in that kind of cosmopolitan direction, which can end up very easily as being anti-national, and therefore, by implication, also anti-multicultural nationalism. So I think we do need to, we meaning those of us who are seriously committed to equality and diversity, we do need to reevaluate if that is a worthwhile trend and whether we shouldn't give more value to the national than some people have done. Secondly, what I'd say, and I've kind of started working on this in the last few years, is that I can see that some of the resentments that the populists are mobilizing and garnering are actually anxieties about identity and belonging, which is exactly the kinds of parallel anxieties to the ones that multiculturalism always focuses on in relation to minorities. So we now have a situation where majorities are also saying they're worried about their identities.
Well, they are behaving like minorities. I mean,
yeah, if you like. Yeah,
like
if you like.
It's like a preemptive minoritism. Preemptive minoritism. You know.
Yeah. So I've kind of come to the view that actually multiculturalism now needs to think more than it has done in the past about what is the place of the majorities or majority cultural features in multiculturalism or in the national story, in the national citizenship, in the national story going forward. We know that it has a very big place in the historic national story, but presumably we're not breaking apart.
You know,
we want to reform it and remake it. So we then have to think actually, so what then is the place? We want to see minorities better located in the national story, more respectfully included. But we also have to have some sense of what is the appropriate place for the majority in the national story. Not a kind of majority domination, but just rightful. And I think we had kind of thinking, and I think this is one of the challenges that the populism that you're talking about throws up for multiculturalism. And I want to get to a point where multiculturalism isn't just, but it's also about the place of the majority.
You know, one of the interesting things is it depends on how short or how long the arc of change you're examining. So if you look at the last 5-10 years, then it is really very depressing. However, if you were to look at a longer period, then it is clearly the trend is towards recognition of the importance of diversity, recognition of the importance of that diversity is an asset and it is a strength, and even people with different cultures are adding to the national project rather than diminishing the national identity in this project. Now, I had a student who said one of the problems we have, Dr. Khan, in our country is that it is getting flooded by inferior cultures, and he used the word inferior culture. So I made him write a paper about the CEO of Google, Microsoft, and IBM, and all of these three come from India. And it was very interesting. At the end of the paper, he said, "I understand what you're trying to do, but programming is not culture. You know, so they're good at programming. So what?" But I wanted to share with you because we have a similar problem. At least I'm from India, and I see that while most countries in the West, at least European countries, are struggling to try and integrate Muslims, we see India struggling to disintegrate them. It's like they have had a great multicultural, multi-religious tradition for a long time. Now they want to actually problematize it. And in that context, I remember I was doing some research in Turkey and started talking to lots of Sufis who I would not meet otherwise. And they met me with great respect. And I realized that they were doing so because I was from India, and they would say, "Oh, you're from Hindustan," and they would just get up and meet with me. And I noticed this even in the Middle East, "Anta min al-Hind," and they would say, so they would use the word Hindi in a very respectful way. And I realized that Muslims who coined this phrase of Hindustan for India now don't use the word Hindustan at all. In fact, they are fighting Hindutva. It's an interesting analogy of what is the majority identity. And I think that your project of focusing on what's happening with the identity reconstruction of the majorities in these countries with the rise of ethno-nationalism perhaps is an additional element of the multicultural project, which I think needs to be taken more seriously. And I am extremely grateful for this wonderful conversation that we have had. And I'm sure my students will definitely benefit from the insights. I've been reading your work for the last 4 or 5 days, and I find it very interesting. I mean, you have been a pioneer in this area, and and I think it is, regardless of what happens, the point that you made that we cannot work towards racial equality without also redefining the society and national identity as a multicultural society, without also rethinking the project of secularism. So I'm extremely grateful and appreciative of your scholarship, Professor Modood. If you have any last comments, I will be happy to listen.
No, except words, trying to hear them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stop recording.